Hello, in this video I'm going to talk about an update I just did to the DCA module requested by one of our subscribers, Comrader. This update is not really necessary for most people unless you specifically use the price method for trading. Remember that the price method has no budget constraints and can be extremely unpredictable and unforgiving. This update allows the price method to dynamically switch between an aggressive state and a defensive state based upon the price deviation between the current price and the average, or the number of purchases it has already accumulated, or both. This could be a third look of the DCA module, so let's get started and take a look at it. On the chart is a simple momentum-based moving average that is quite aggressive. Nothing really special about the process, except this is not an inverted moving average. Well, it'd help if it'd stay on the screen. I went it this way to show just how aggressive the process is and how the process of the dynamic price method works versus price aggression or price defensive. So that's it, pretty straightforward for the momentum. Now let's look at the DCA module and its changes. Currently it is default two-step as normal. We will change this to price. And you will see here it says it will take a maximum purchase of 200. Now right now nothing is set up. It's in defensive state. All of the basics are what we are normally used to for a price defensive approach. Now we are going to put it in aggressive mode. And you see that it will take 766 purchases. So the dynamic mode will be somewhere between the defensive and the aggressive. And it will pick based upon these criteria how it wants to act and operate. Now once you turn it on, what you put here is irrelevant. And I will demonstrate that. We will wait for it to take effect. And you see nothing happens because we didn't tell it anything. 0 means it's disabled. If you don't actually put something in it, it reverts back to its previous methodology, aggressive. So let's put, we know this is 766 purchases. So it's in an aggressive state by default when you begin. So let's change this to, as soon as it goes over 100 purchases, it switches down to a defensive state. So we'll put that in, press enter, and notice it dropped to 580 purchases. So that means as soon as one trade cycle goes over 100 purchases, it immediately switches back to a defensive price action. Now let's drop it even further. Let's go to 30 purchases. So as you can see, it is now dropped to 361. So the lower this number goes, as long as it's 1 or greater. For example, if we set it at 3, then it starts out pretty close to price defensive right away. So you can control how aggressive the system starts out as and continues as. So for this position, for the dynamic buys, as soon as you accumulate more than 3 purchases, it immediately reverts back to a defensive state. This one's the easy one. Let's put this back. Goes back to what it was. Default settings of aggression. Now let's talk about the percentage. This is a little bit harder to deal with. And for this, we need to blow up the chart a little so you can see the numbers. Because the relevant numbers, I'm going to do that. Let's actually just open this up. The relevant numbers that you need to be aware of are right here. Let's see if we can zoom in on this number. This number is the indicator of the percentage variation. So if this number is below the average by a certain percentage, then it will affect the cycle between aggressive and defensive. Now you are still using the price method. It's just it picks which side of the pendulum it wants to be on based upon the criteria you give it. So let's come back down here and let's say as soon as the price goes, or as soon as there is a difference of 5% between the average price and the price action, immediately trigger a defensive state. And you'll notice that it reduced drastically the amount of total purchases it took on. It also reduced the number of maximum buys because, of course, in the defensive state, it very much controls this number as well as the aggressive state. So now, let's say we want to go in a much deeper distance. 10% difference between the price and the average. So every time your price action is 10% below the deviation, or excuse me, 10% below the average, it automatically switches to a defensive state. And notice how much it reduced everything. So let's look at the chart. First, let's put this back to auto fit. And now let's actually look at price action, deviation, and you can see right here some of the impact. Let's zoom into this area since it looks like it's pretty active. So let's come over here. Let's go down to, let's turn this off. And let's go to defensive. Notice how many signals disappeared here. So this is defensive price method. This is aggressive price method. The black line, of course, is the price action. The blue line is the average price. Now let's turn it on. And let's see if we can spot the difference. Can't spot the difference? Let's make it a little more visible and drop the dynamic percentage to 3%. Now you see anytime the dynamic percentage is greater than 3% from the price action to the average, then it immediately reverts back to a defensive state. So you can actually take and tune how aggressive you want the entire system to be based upon a very carefully monitored criteria. And you can see as you move and work, the chart will change appropriate to the deviation cycle you are putting into the system, where you can be very aggressive and very defensive. And remember that as you change these numbers, it reevaluates the chart, and the deviation and the average fluctuate based upon each change. So finding the middle ground for your percentage can be tricky. As you can see, just by going one by one, watching the blue line change and watching the black line change, I notice how much of a difference 1% makes. So 1 percentile difference has a curved slope here versus a much more squared off or rectangular slope. So each time you reevaluate your percentage difference for a dynamic percentile, you will find that the system responds appropriately to the entire process. This is perhaps the most aggressive aspect of it because the percentages are so dynamic and fluctuative. Unlike the purchases that are absolute, the purchases offer a much more constrained approach. So if you have 700 purchases as your maximum aggression, and as soon as you go over 20 purchases, you want to go from aggressive to defensive, the system will do that quite quickly, and it will begin to affect the entire metric of everything that comes after that point. The same with the dynamic percentages. If you have an 8% dynamic, as you can see between 8 and 9, it dramatically impacts everything after that point. There's not much of a difference between 7 and 8, although there is some. Let's look at 6. So as you change these percentages and you see the deviation, it doesn't take much to realize how little or how quick something will change. But of course, that's not the entire story. Let's look at the entire story going back to March 2020. Okay, where are we at for the calendar? February. There we go. Should be January. Okay, 2021. Okay, now we're in 2020. So now let's November. Okay, let's see. Getting there slowly. What month was this? August of 2020. July. We're getting there. Eventually, we're going to end up having to go to the 2-hour chart. June. Okay, May, March, April, May, June. So we need to go all the way back to March. Almost there. And I believe this is March. Yep, so there it is. So let's look at this. Let's shrink it up. There we go. So that's the drop that we're used to seeing. Now let's expand it back out where we can actually see closely how this drop is affected with the price aggression. Okay, let's get this where we can see it. Now, for the standards, let's do our control. Turn this off. This is full aggression. So as we can see, complete full aggression. It just took this all the way down. Let's put this in defensive. And you can see it reduces everything drastically. Now let's turn this on. It's going to default to aggressive. So that is full aggression. And now let's take a look at, say, let's go back to 9%. Okay, now let's take it down to 8% and watch the changes, if any. This is really going to be the only way you're going to be able to figure out the fluctuative differences between the price action and the average. Is you're going to have to pick a place and then watch the numbers. And when you have drops like this, it's just a matter of keeping track. The lower you go, the more defensive you become. The higher you go, the more aggressive you become. Or if you just want to go with a full aggressive state, let's put this back to aggressive. Okay, here we are, and now let's just lob this off at 30. So if it's more than 30, go from aggressive to defensive. Okay, not much of a change, so let's do, again, same thing, play with the numbers till you see what you're looking for in the chart. Okay, we're starting to see changes, and this is between aggressive and defensive. And when you're using dynamic buys, once it goes into a defensive state, it stays there until it sells off the asset. Then it returns to an aggressive state. It's not like the percentage that fluctuates based upon the distance between the price action and the average. Once the buys goes over the threshold, it remains defensive. it does not fluctuate dynamically the way the percentage does. Now you can use both at once or either of them independently. The choice is yours. But the new systems offer a drastically more advanced defensive system. Now the sharp drops aren't going to be as interesting as what I call the cascades. And this is what you would see as a cascade. Of course, if you go back to the candlesticks, you can see it cascading down like a waterfall. These are the ones that are going to prove to be the most interesting, I believe, because they are the least likely to show a slowdown. And I say that on the terms, if you look at a steep hill, and that's kind of what this looks like, you see it cascading downward, but it looks like it's just not stopping. I personally believe this is where percentage dynamics are going to offer an interesting approach. Because this is where things are going to get tricky between the deviation of the price action and the average. Because this will fluctuate back and forth between aggressive and defensive based upon this continual fluctuations. So that's what makes this one interesting, probably more so than the purchases. So let's see how it looks. Here's another cascade. And you can see a lot of purchases here. So when you're working with this new format, take the time to really play with the numbers. Okay, so let's put this back at 0, and that is full aggression. Look at all this, the cascading effect. So, if we go over 10 purchases, boom, here you see it, aggression 10, instant switch to a defensive state, and it remains that way. Now let's take a look at this. Let's start at a 10%. It may or may not change. Dynamic percentage is very different than dynamic purchases. So it's just a matter of seeing and watching the interplay between the average and the price action. And this really is a very powerful mechanism when you want to get an aggressive approach on the market, but you still want to keep it from getting too out of control, like Beam or CVC or some other crazy coins. This is the best way to really look at dynamic percentage. So as you can see, a 5% variation between the price action and the average versus a 6% variation between the price action and the average versus a 7% variation. Notice that there's not much difference, if any, between 6 and 7%, but 5% has a dramatic difference. So between 5% and 6% price deviation, you have a dramatic impact. That is significant because that has a huge reduction of purchases. Now, as I said, you can use this on step, but the way step is designed, you don't see it, so it's not really worth the effort. But if you use the price method, take the time to really work with these numbers. Now, you will have to update the DCA module on all of your charts to get the latest version. And it's simply a matter of removing the old one and then putting the DCA module back onto it, which will give you the latest version that this is. If you do not use price method, you do not need to update anything. This is only an impact if and only if you use the price method of your chart. Outside that, it has no impact whatsoever. Test it, watch it, track it carefully, and you will be able to actually find a happy medium between aggressive and defensive, so that even the most aggressive routines can still be a little bit more controlled. For example, 252 purchases versus 700 purchases. That's a difference of $3,000 versus $8,000. And if we want to spend some time looking at some coins, let's bring up the coin chart. Let's go to Binance since all the weird coins are there. Let's start here. Actually, let's start here. And let's see the difference. Now, I'm going to start out in full aggression. So let's turn this off. Okay, I'm not seeing things. 1,081 purchases. This is going to be my example, simply because this is basically a $10,000 budget. And this isn't even the maximum that it could be. So that is insane and crazy. But that will definitely prove the point of what happens when you go to a dynamic system. Here's what it looks like in the defensive state. 236. That's a big difference. Let's put it back in aggressive state. Let's turn this on. And let's see what happens when we go to a limit of 100 purchases. Well, right off the bat, we went from 1,000 down to 260. And it capped it pretty quickly. Okay, that's good, but that's not the fun part. All right, now let's repeat that since it got. Okay, so 900. Okay, so as it goes over 30 purchases, it remains until it sells off. And even still, that is just insane. 871 purchases. So let's put this back to 0. Let's go to a basic 10%. Okay, so as soon as it crosses 10%, it goes defensive, and bang, we just shaved off 300 trades. Let's go to 9%. Okay, let's go to 8%. Now the thing of it is as soon as the price action gets above this distance, it automatically goes to defensive. But as soon as the price action gets close to the average, it goes back to aggressive. So it will fluctuate dynamically throughout the entire trade cycle. Unlike the number of purchases or the dynamic buys. Once that crosses that threshold, that's absolute. That trade cycle is defensive for the rest of the entire cycle. Whereas this will fluctuate drastically according to where the price action is in relation to the average. So for right here, if the price action is greater than 5% distance from the average, then it is in a defensive state. But if the price action is less than 5% of the average, then it is an aggressive state. And you can see carefully that the impact is dramatic. So as you're working with this system, play with the numbers, take your time, and you will find an incredible tool and resource. But be sure you understand just exactly what the price method really is versus the step. It is not something you take lightly. This is a $2,000 budget, minimum. Remember, there are no constraints on the price method. This coin could easily take a $10,000 budget. There's no way of knowing. And that is a very severe problem for the price method. That you do need to plan carefully. And sometimes, even with all of the planning, a sharp market will wreck you. So you need to really think about how you trade and the recipe you use. I used a very aggressive approach. A price method on a more constrained approach, like a double MACD or a Bollinger's MACD, can be quite impressive. Until next time.